So I'm sitting with Emeritus Professor John Lawrence and Dr. Ruth Lawrence, and we're just talking about social work and how it came to be. Very exciting to be here holding space and sharing space. So we're just talking about how Emeritus Professor Lawrence came to social work and has pioneered social work, was the first professor in Australia of social work, and how his own journey was foundational in developing what the discipline looks like today. So thanks.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this with you. That's the first thing to say. I guess the place to start is that in my late teens, I didn't have a clear vocational goal. In other words, the world was my oyster in terms of possible employment. I was lucky enough at St Peter's College in Adelaide to have a vocational guidance officer. He was the first psychologist appointed by a private school to help with vocational guidance. So it's most fortuitous that I happened to have that connection. And he recommended that I think seriously about doing a social work course at Adelaide University, as well as a social science degree, a degree in the social sciences. And he said that that would set me up for some kind of future employment in relation to helping other human beings.
And what year was this?
This would have been, my final year at school was 1949. And so I went to Adelaide University on a state scholarship. I was lucky enough to get one of those. And I particularly had done well in the ancient and modern history subjects in my final years at school. So I was always interested in historical depth and understanding. At Adelaide University, I was the first young Australian male to do the Adelaide University social work course. And that is, I say young, that is straight from school. There were a few ex-servicemen who'd done the course. And so that's the way my first beginning understanding of what social work was about was developed. I was very lucky to have Amy Wheaton as my teacher and head of that course. She was a most unusual woman, a social work educator, and she was a very early sociologist in Australia. And as you most likely know, Australia had not developed sociology as a discipline until really very late. There were developed other social science disciplines, but not sociology. And the other social science disciplines tend to claim that they dealt with what sociology dealt with anyway. Of course they didn't. So I became very alive to that very early in my own education. I was lucky enough to get a Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford, and that meant that I had the opportunity to do philosophy, politics and economics, modern greats as they're called there, and had very good tutors, particularly in politics, he became a good friend of both my wife and I. My wife came with me. She wasn't my wife then. I wasn't allowed to be married because of the scholarship.
Isn't it wonderful?
It is. I like that.
Rhodes didn't want young men to be distracted.
Yes, that's what I was just thinking.
Little did he know, or perhaps he did. He knew only too well. And so what happened was that that was an extraordinarily good and interesting experience, not just for me, but for my future wife. So we were grounded in general education. We did a trip in an old car in Europe in the summer holidays. when I should have been working on my courses, my reading. But my tutor was, he said, look, John, this is your general education. This is your European tour. It's part of your general education. So they were very good and supportive. My philosophy tutor, Harry Walden, very interesting man. He, in fact, was involved in the Second World War as a philosophy advisor to Bomber Harris.
Wow.
And Bomber Harris was the very controversial head of all that bombing of civilians in German cities. And so trying to provide philosophical advice to him would have been a challenge.
Totally.
And in fact, he did disengage from that job before Dresden was bombed and so on. So he was only too well aware of what was going on. Anyway, I can't dwell on any of this, but that's the sort of background and foundational background to a lot of what came subsequently.
Fantastic. And so the years that you were a Rhodes Scholar overseas at Oxford,
Yeah.
what year was this, or what year period?
That would be 1954 to about mid-1956.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Great.
that's right. And then I came back to Australia
Yes.
and again, uncertain about which direction to go. I realised that social work values were really what I was really developing a real interest in.
Right.
And so I came back and engaged as a social worker in the Department of Social Services. At that stage, the Department of Social Services had a most unusual head of department, Lyra Taylor, who was extraordinarily able and recognised as such within the Commonwealth Public Service, although it had all the disadvantages of being of the wrong sex. And she ran a social work department across the whole of the country, and that social work department had a whole lot of, built up a library and a whole lot of really insightful understandings of what was entailed in trying to provide a social work service in a Commonwealth bureaucracy.
Wow.
So I couldn't have had a better initiation.
Yes.
I had a brief period working with the family agency prior to that, but my main early social work practice experience was actually in a casework setting. I worked with a lot of rehabilitation cases. I had to go down to Victor Harbour, the rehabilitation centre down in south of Adelaide. So again, all foundational experience.
Yes.
I didn't know then, of course, I was pointing where it was heading. And anyway, towards the end of that period, I saw advertised PhD scholarships at the Australian National University, which was very young in those days, just being founded as a very important postgraduate university and encouraging research, especially for Australian university scholars. I was lucky enough to get one of those, and I can remember I was interviewed in Canberra, and they said, look, we're interested in your application, but what's this topic that you want to study? The history of professional social work in Australia was what I nominated, because I realised by this stage social work was the area that it really did look as if I was more and more interested in. And I said, well, I don't want to take up the scholarship unless I can do that topic. Fortunately, Mick Burry, W.D. Burry, who was a very famous demographer, not just within Australia, but worldwide, he was on the selection committee and subsequently became one of my supervisors. He very much supported my application, and he had briefly taught social history at Sydney University. So he's had some understanding of social work background. And those were very productive 3 years of really hard work of research, where Trish and I would go to different cities, mainly Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, and we spent period looking at the material on social work education, especially in those cities.
Right. And what years were these?
This would have been 1956. Sorry, no, that's wrong. This would have been 1960
Yes.
to, let me think. Sorry,
Oh, good.
I've got it now. It was 1958
Yes.
to 1960. That's where. And then I went to Sydney University, where there was the first lectureship in social administration. And social administration, of course, was a well-known concept in Britain, where, and in those days, social administration was really what we these days would call social policy, or social policy and administration.
Right.
And so that was a pioneering opportunity to develop that subject within a social work course, but the course was also available to students in the arts faculty.
Right.
So some of my students, for example, Charles Perkins, who subsequently became a very important Aboriginal or Indigenous leader. He did my course.
Oh, wow.
And I could hear some of what I'd been talking about in the lectures involved in what he was talking about when he went on the freedom lines. So anyway, and it so happened too that my brother, Jim, he was a very senior, subsequently became a very senior medical academic. In fact, at one stage he was the Deputy Dean of the Medical School at Sydney University. Now Jim, when the first kidney transplant business in Australia, down at Elizabeth Hospital in South Australia, and Charlie Perkins benefited from his outfit, and they did a kidney transplant on Charlie. And so Charlie, some years later, told Jim, he said, you know, the Lawrence brothers have had significant impact on me. So anyway, that's just an aside.
No, that's phenomenal. But that goes to the idea that, you know, through social work education, through social administration, you've been able to mobilise social change.
Yes, well, essentially, I mean, well, you know, as far as I'm concerned, everyone, of course, is constantly making decisions, whether we're conscious of it or not. And really, when you start trying to justify change, decisions that you're making, you can characterise that as change, but always circumstances are changing. Every decision is different circumstantially framed.
Have a sip of tea, Pop, and do you want some tea?
I'll pause the recording.
Yeah.
Pause
You
while I
want
have
some
a
Yes.
sip.
Just
So yes, we just had a bit of tea, which is great.
Yeah. So that experience at the ANU, it made me aware that a lot of work had already been done in Australia, but it was at a significantly lower level of achievement, because in fact it was the original diplomas didn't, of course, develop postgraduate opportunities, and they didn't and couldn't become influential in university circles until social education reflected the academic structures that got senior people into the significant decision-making of universities. And that, if ever there was a criticism in that earlier period, was it was very slow in developing degrees and postgraduate opportunities especially. But of course there was a whole lot of resistance to the notion of social work anyway, back at that stage, especially of course when it was associated with women.
Yes.
And it's always a matter of contemplation as to whether the progress would have been significantly quicker if it had been a much more gender balanced student intake and teacher intake. But that did, back in the time when this was operating, social work was operating, helping profession, and that meant helping individuals and people, one-to-one, personal, without real understanding of the essential understanding of structures. So that period was, again, it was foundational in terms of a whole lot of what happened to me subsequently, because I got to know the senior decision makers within social work across the country, and they got to know me because of that. Always interesting to see the politics of what they were telling me, and sometimes getting different versions from different people, of course, of the supposedly same events. Very insightful it was. And I was always, as I mentioned earlier, interested in historical perspective anyway. So all that fed into what I was doing. Subsequently, when I went to Sydney University, when I had finished the doctorate, I looked at various possible job options. One would have been to go to Melbourne University, where Ruth Lawrence, a very controversial head of the social work course at Melbourne University, wanted me to come and apply for a deputy to her in the department. But of course it was far, far too early for me to be having that kind of position. And I was acutely aware of this. I was very strongly urged by Norma Parker, who of course, amongst all the others, I think most likely was the outstanding social work educator in that first generation. She became the first federal president of the ASW. Norma strongly advised me. She said, "Look, John, of course it's your decision, but I think it would be a mistake at this stage to go in that context." And of course, just well, I didn't in a way, because in fact, I found in the course of my research and so on that the deep divisions in that school of social work, a lot of it got focused upon the actual personality of Ruth Lawrence, would have been quite destructive. And so I didn't go that route. Instead, I chose the social policy route, or social admin route, at Sydney University, which obviously linked up with all the broader background I have in the social sciences. The only other job option I looked at seriously was a community work job for a council of social services. And trouble is, when I looked at the pay structure, by this stage I had 2 children, and we had 2 children, and the third on the way.
Right, which is present in this conversation, Dr. Ruth Lawrence.
And the kind of money that was available was so low, and that again reflected the assumptions that it was primarily a woman's occupation, and didn't have the long-term career structures that male occupations had developed. So, again, I didn't ever regret going that way, because at Sydney University, of course, I had Norma Parker, who was the initially, well, at that stage, she deputy, or she was the director of professional studies at Sydney University, which I always thought was a silly title because the whole course was about professional studies. But that was to differentiate the practice element and the rest of the course. And Norma and Kate Ogilvy was again a very key figure in social work education, in medical social work education. And Kate and Norma, they were very different personalities, both extraordinarily competent and very strong personalities. They sort of complemented each other, even though at times they were at loggerheads. I had them in that department and couldn't have had more support from those kinds of people in terms of my own career. Norma had a strong American social work education interest and background, and when it came to me being due for a sabbatical, there was no question in my mind that I needed to get it in social work education in America. And that's when I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and was lucky enough to get one at Michigan University. That was a quite extraordinary, again, opportunity and period. This would have been in 1967, and that was the period when the race riots were on. The student protests were at their peak. The Vietnam War was well and truly being questioned, and it was a quite extraordinary period of social turmoil. Now, the University of Michigan was very interestingly placed near Detroit, where a lot of this stuff was really at its peak in the United States, but not in Detroit. But they had practical work opportunities for community workers, especially in Detroit. So you can imagine the kinds of debates that were going on within the staff, or within the faculty then. And I, when I was there, again, very generous, I co-taught comparative social policy course with Phil Booth, who was a very interesting, experienced person in the American Social Security system. The head of the School of Social Work there was a very experienced fellow also, who experienced in the social work, in the Social Security system, and so very strongly grounded in that part of the American social structure stuff. I won't talk at great length about any of this, but just a brief, quick survey so we can see what's grounded me in the long term. From there, I then had to think in terms of my own security and future, and my family's security and future back here in Australia. My family had come with me, of course, and our kids had had a particularly good experience in the Ann Arbor educational system in America. Again, it was scandalous just how good it was compared with what was going on in schooling systems elsewhere in the country. And that reflected the fact of very much a local, academically influenced set of parents influencing that school system. From there, when I came back to Australia, I was lucky enough to be appointed to the first chair of social work in Australia.
And what year was this?
And this would have been, I took up the appointment late 1968.
Amazing.
Amazing.
And the Norma Parker, right at the end of her teaching career at Sydney University, had been recruited by University of New South Wales to go across to the University of New South Wales to head up the social work course that had been developing there under Morven Brown. Professor Morven Brown had been, for a brief period, head of the School of Social Work at Sydney University. But then he went to the first chair of sociology in Australia at University of New South Wales. And he and Norma were very, very good friends, as well as had great respect for each other professionally. He recruited Norma to come across and save his own bacon, if the truth be known. Because the University of New South Wales course was in an utter mess with students. One of the council members, the story goes, had a daughter who had taken on this social work course at New South Wales and had been promised recognition by the UNSW at the end of this would be. So, and it threatened not to happen. And so the university had to do something, and so Norma went and saved their bacon, and Morven Brown's bacon. Right. He died, unfortunately, before she took up the appointment. Right. And Norma was in that position just for about a year, I suppose, before I took up the appointment. My appointment was a legacy of Norma there, influencing the university to set up a full chair. And yeah.
Yes, so I was going to ask for people that may be listening, what is the difference between a head of social work, which Norma was previously, and a chair role that was established?
The difference is there are different levels of the academic structure. Norma was an associate professor, but not yet a full professor. It wasn't a full professor. But when her legacy there was the advertisement for a full professorship and for it to be got out from underneath the arts faculty and to be an independent, autonomous school. And in terms of structures, of course, that's the only thing that makes sense anyway. So that very quickly is the sort of structure I went into. And so I was extraordinarily fortunate to get that appointment and to have the opportunity to shape a social work course, influenced by all the things around me, of course.
Yes.
And I decided that the way to go was a 4-year degree in social work that had social work education as the focus of all the things that were being included in the course, and that would mean that social work practice would go over more than just 2 years. 2 years is too short for effective professional socialisation. So that's and I put a lot of emphasis at field education. I call it field education, not field work. And we appointed a director of field education,
yes,
who was hopefully going to be a very senior person eventually,
yes,
to get integrated with the rest. So social work education always had a strong grounding in its practical work. It didn't come in Australia via academic people coming in and then saying, well, what can we do in a practical part of this? It started out from the agencies, influencing from what the agencies were learning and the clients and what was needed to educate them.
yes.
So that's the history of the grounding of that PSW at New South Wales, and we were amongst the first of the Australian universities to offer the social work course at a degree level.
At Sydney University.
No, this was at
it's-
University of New South Wales.
Right.
Sydney University still had not conferred its diploma to a degree.
Right.
That did not come, in fact, till some years later.
In what year?
I can't remember precisely when they made the transition.
Right. Were you at UNSW?
I was at
then?
New South Wales when I was there.
Right. Right.
And Tom Brennan, the professor of sociology, who was a long-term director of social work education, that whole it was social education, but he was the sociology director of it. He worked very closely with Norma Parker when she went across to before she went across to New South Wales.
Okay.
And he regretted very much losing, of course, that collaboration with Norma.
So just to clarify, so being the first chair of social work at the University of Sydney.
No, New South
And New
Wales.
South Wales.
New South
Yeah.
Wales.
Yeah, this was New South Wales, you see.
Right. Who was the first chair at Sydney?
The first chair at Sydney didn't come until, some years later. I can't remember the precise date, but they were a laggard.
Right.
And ironically, you see, the Sydney, who'd been one of the very early pioneers in social education,
Yes.
because of what was happening in the university,
Yes.
there was a lot of resistance to social education initially,
Yes.
and there was a major review committee set up in the early 50s, I think it was,
Yes.
and Norma Parker and Kate Ogilvy were on that review, and they managed to keep the social education in the university against the wishes of people like the very powerful John Anderson, who was the professor of philosophy. But the so-called solution at that stage was to make it a postgraduate course.
This is really interesting because I know that Sydney University, the University of Sydney, has the oldest social work degree per se. We celebrated 80 years in 1920 because we started in 1940 and then Melbourne started 6 months later.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Was that the degree or the diploma?
That was initially it was a
diploma.
diploma.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think
You
that's
see, it
what
was
they've done.
initially a diploma. It wasn't a degree initially.
No,
No.
that's right.
So that's
And that's a very important distinction. And of course, until you've got social work recognised as an important undergraduate basic course, professional grounding in social work, you can't develop adequate postgraduate social work qualifications unless you just pretend by saying you can do a research degree on some subject relevant to social work, that's adequate.
Yeah, specific.
It's not.
That's right. So specific units of study
Yeah.
that are specifically aligned to the profession of social work
Yeah.
and what that actually means within an undergraduate degree.
That's right. And we developed at University of New South Wales a master's degree in social work and then subsequently a PhD in social work that we could, which you could do then. And in other words, we mirrored the academic structures that were familiar to the university structure. And that, in fact, set up the structure there, which again got mimicked elsewhere in the country, because it's a fairly obvious structure to have. So that all gives you some understanding of the background. Then subsequently, we finally managed to get ourselves a second chair of social work at University of New South Wales. Ron Baker was appointed that. He was a senior lecturer down in Melbourne at one of the newer universities at La Trobe, I think it was, or was it Monash? Gosh. Anyway, and Ron was specifically appointed as the professor of social work practice. And you see, that was a quite deliberate choice to complement me. I did not present myself as a professor of social work practice primarily. I was a social work educator, but not social work practice. That was not my expertise. My expertise was in the social policy area.
Yes.
And I would argue, of course, that a very broad concept of social work practice is social work practice is what committed social work professionals do to enhance the value base, the values that social work's about. And so you can argue that social work educators are a particular sort of social work practitioner. You don't hear that argument now very often, obviously for obvious reasons, but you can see why.
Yes, and I think at different universities across the country, there's always an emphasis on the underlying teaching and learning philosophy that underpins social work education. And a lot of universities continue to focus on this practice-led approach to learning and teaching in social work education.
Yeah.
Is that the foundation in which we should continue to be operating?
No, I think that the very last thing I've written, actually, it was in the Professional Journal of Social Work, just 2 or 3 years ago, I suppose. I was asked if I might contribute to a special issue of the Social Work Journal on any topic that I chose. And what I chose was to write about the ethical foundation of social work education. Now, if you take that seriously, you look at what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of practice skills will enhance the claimed objectives of social education and be able to justify that in an ethical discourse.
Yes.
Not just a political discourse or an economic discourse or so-called practical discourse and so on. So that's a bit of an indirect answer to your question, but at base, that's what I'm talking about.
It's interesting when people ask me, what does social work do?
Yeah.
Or what does social work education, what is a course about? I always say that we somewhat beg, borrow and steal from different disciplines. So we look at sociology, we look at psychology, we look at human services and welfare, organisational theory, medicine, health. Is that a good indication of what we generally might do? We're multidisciplinary by default because...
the whole term multidisciplinary, when you unscramble it, is a dog's breakfast. You're talking about whole lots of different kinds of intellectual, historically intellectual developments that have developed ways of looking at the world in an abstract way. And each of the so-called claimed professions, established professions, has managed to carve out its particular terrain and perpetuate that through the educational system. And so social work education, what I said before was that where do you get the sort of insights that you need for social work practice? For example, to get an understanding of the way people think and work and so on when they're in some kind of difficulty or when they're seen as being deprived or in some way disadvantaged. The way to think about that is that, you always need to know where that person is located in their social structure. Always. Their social structure, not yours. And that then leads you back into, how do you get the relevant things? Now, you don't steal from those other areas, you draw from them.
I like that. You've called me out for saying stealing from the other things, but I agree with you. I agree. You definitely draw from those other disciplines to make sense of the individual in their context.
That's right. And in fact, when you're drawing from them, and if you've got a good relationship with the people in each of those disciplines, you can then, in fact, give them feedback to their discipline for them to be better informed in future about the way they're developing.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I'm constantly saying to our students that we turn up into different multidisciplinary areas or fields, including hospital settings and other locations where we might be present. And I always remind our students, what is our point of difference? And it's exactly what you just said. It's understanding the person in front of you in their social context, and
the person that you're dealing with. And so you've got to get some understanding of the person living their lives over time. You live your life over a period of time. And so and it's always an interaction between the person and the environment, or if you're focusing upon a group well-being, that group's interaction with its environment, and so on. And so, but of course, to achieve what I'm talking about does require a degree of confidence and power that you must always be aware of. But of course, you've got to be aware of it so that you don't get sucked in by what makes you feel.
Yes.
And so, again, the focus being on some sort of ethical balance. And you never lose sight of the fact that whoever's intervening, the practitioner, they've got a life to lead just the same as who they're helping to lead. And you see, and that's why, as a theory, altruism is a defective ethical base, just per se. It's always altruism. If your focus is always on the other and never on the person who's helping the other, you can do enormous damage to the person providing helping. And there's been an enormous neglect in professionalisation right across the board of what's entailed for the actual practitioners in leading a life of this kind. And all this business about, I never like the term burnout, where people in fact are described as if they're machines. Machines burn out. Human beings don't burn out. Human beings get exhausted, they get overstretched, they get a whole lot of other things. So again, it's a matter of having a very acute awareness of people as persons, and all the writing about personhood and so on, you'll find in moral philosophy, is quite crucial to understanding what I'm talking about. And it gives you as a practitioner grounding in what you're doing and makes your life tolerable. Otherwise, life would be, and it often is for some poor devils, intolerable. And so they don't last the distance or they crack up.
Yes, I agree. I might pause in a second before I do that, because I want to give you an opportunity to take a breath and have a drink. I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just thinking in that moral stance too. I think one of the differentiating factors, obviously, in personhood is that agency and that empowerment. Yeah, which is a complete differentiation from other professions. That whole self-determination and empowerment and agency, and I think that's absolutely critical differentiating aspect of the profession as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ruth. And agency, the notion of agency, I think is a peculiarly human concept, because it implies consciousness, that you know what you're doing, and you're an agent to achieve what you're doing.
Yes.
There's always that complicated relationship between means and ends. And it is complicated. If you think about it deeply and carefully. Fortunately, we don't think about it all the time because we grind to a halt. But for really significant areas of decision making, it's important to be explicit about it.
Yes, definitely. A couple of my reflections on what's being shared is, yes, I also share with my students that my ability to be in this field of work, even as a practitioner, I still do some clinical work outside of my academic role, is by virtue of those professional skills and boundaries that I've developed, and as you said, from the ethical base in which we are located, to understand my own role. And one of the things I say often to students, especially when I'm engaging with them in various areas of topic areas. Last semester I taught mainly on social policy, but also other practical skills and engaging communities in that process of developing good policy. Was how do we create good relationships and rapport with the communities in which we're located? And it's those micro skills that are so important. And I said I use this example quite often, I'll say, do you find me warm and able to have a good conversation with me and build rapport? And students will say, yes, we find you engaging. And I say, but you know nothing about me personally, do you? And they say, no, not at all. We don't know anything about you. And I'm like, well, this is part of what social work brings to these conversations, are these micro skills and those other attributes that enable us to build rapport with the person that we're working with to maintain that level of professionalism as we continue to sustain a career.
Well, I can remember years ago, when I was at Sydney University still, I was invited to give an interview connected with the National Social Work Conference. It was down in Melbourne, and about social work practice, connected with this conference that was taking place. And I was invited as a young bloke, who was early in his profession and so on. And my colleagues at Sydney University, when we'd have lunch together in the weeks beforehand, would be grilling me with questions in preparation for me performing before this panel.
Yes.
And that was an interesting experience. And I was just very briefly sucked into being attracted to the notion of doing media stuff.
Unfortunately, I've fallen into that. I've started to do a bit of media stuff.
And I decided, that's not the way to go if we really, I mean, it may be a satisfactory way to go. And I've always perhaps been too reluctant to engage with the media because of my awareness of how rarely, when you do engage, they give an adequate account of what you've said, and they put it within their frame of reference, not in any other frame of reference.
So a lot of my media engagement now is writing opinion pieces that actually Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and ABC publish. Is there a role for social workers to
yes, there is. No question. And I was saying I've shortchanged that area in my own work because I had plenty elsewhere on anyway. On the other hand, the person who later became my very close colleague, my closest colleague at University of New South Wales, Professor Tony Vincent, he was the person who at New South Wales University took over from me as head of school. We'd recruited Tony into the second chair when Tony had done very interesting work in trying to achieve prison reform. And the RAN government had decided to withdraw its support because in fact they found that there were no votes in prison reform. And Tony eventually resigned from that. And we appointed Tony to that second chair at that stage. That relates to another development at University of New South Wales, where we had in fact at New South Wales University appointed Tony as the director of what was then called the Social Welfare Research Centre, which was a national centre directly funded by the federal government. Most unusual development within the Australian scene. That's got a long history, the development of that centre. I was centrally involved in the establishment of that centre at the University of New South Wales because I had very good relationships with senior people in the Department of Social Services. And Max Ryle, who was originally head of the research section in the Department of Social Services, he was very keen indeed for that development to take place, and he and I really, in terms of what was happening with the departmental structures and recommendation of the government, we played a pretty significant role in getting the University of New South Wales to get that actual money coming to the University of New South Wales as a national centre with a focus, for me, it was a focus on social policy or social welfare. We called it then a Social Welfare Research Centre, but that's using the social welfare in the broad sense of social welfare, social well-being.
Yes.
And Tony, in fact, didn't take up that offer of appointment. He, in fact, at that stage, decided to go to the University of Newcastle, who was heading up, who were developing a new medical school, and the David Madison was the new dean of that centre at Newcastle University. He had been the dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Sydney University, but had found it utterly impossible to change the structures there because of the older medical establishments. David Madison was a psychiatrist. Most unusual for a psychiatrist to achieve that kind of appointment within the medical structures. So David Madison went to University of New South Wales and recruited Tony to teach in his new program.
It's always interesting to hear social work move between different areas. Social work is located in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney, but there's always varying conversations that I get as chair around where do we also work alongside and or where's our natural fit, whether it might be in allied health or with the social policy and sociology, which are all in separate sort of schools and or faculty.
Yes.
What's your broader take on where social work is located?
Well, at the University of New South Wales, we initially had a hopeless location in the academic structure in that there were about 3 or 4 schools that had been in the arts faculty and hadn't worked out for them. They were professional schools. And they were grouped together in the thing that was set up by Baxter, who was a very powerful physicist, who was an early Vice-Chancellor at University of New South Wales, in a faculty of, what was it called? Faculty of Vocational Studies, I think it was called. No, it wasn't a faculty, it was a board of vocational studies. Now, and none of the teaching staff had any membership of that board. One of the early things I had to do at New South Wales University was I became the chair of a committee to change that structure amongst that group of schools. And they were hospital administration, later health administration, librarianship and social work, and industrial arts. Industrial arts was a bit of an unusual one there. But what we did was that we, at the professorial board, I argued the case that the teaching staff should have membership somewhere in the academic structure in a faculty. Now, the outcome of that, I won't go into any details, was that the professorial board was persuaded that it should be, first of all, a faculty of, now what was it? Anyway, it was a two-stage process, and we finished up with the Faculty of Professional Studies. And each of those schools was seen as an autonomous professional area, but sufficient understanding across the borders with the other schools to understand what the other schools were about. And so it was a much, much better constructive professional climate to argue the case with course changes and so on.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I think runs in alignment with how I've positioned how we exist as a professional degree with a professionally oriented focus.
See, I've always thought that in university education, there's always, way back historically, a very significant difference between professional education courses and subject or science education courses, science courses. And the professional courses have got they're a very different educational task from just knowledge development. The professional courses, whether they like it or not, are always focused on using knowledge as well as developing relevant knowledge for use. And that's a bifurcation that's too little understood and still is, and gets terribly blurred for obvious reasons why it happens. Because a lot of the people, of course, who are doing so-called background courses in the social work education or the professional courses, they have often want strong links, of course, across with their basic discipline structures. And that's good as long as, of course, it's not at the cost of their commitment to social work education and primary social work education being their responsibility. So that's, and it all relates to the autonomy of head of school. And where that head of school is located in the academic structures. And if they're at a professorial level, they've got much more chance of being taken notice of than if they're further down the line, or if they're going through en route via a dean of an overarching structure who may have no background in that particular discipline that they're responsible for. And then it's through that, eventually it goes into to council.
Yes.
Now, these are not easy issues. They're continuing issues in academic structures. And more, as the structures have become huge in terms of number, what's happening is that there's developed a whole lot of administrative superstructure above your so-called autonomous heads of each of these disciplines. Now, I've always thought, from way back, that the sociology of professions is an absolutely key subject to get insight and understanding of the things I'm talking about.
Mm.
And you'll see on the shores I've got some of my books reflect some of the background literature. I don't like the word background literature, some of the relevant literature for those kinds of issues. And again, questions of gender come up inevitably because of the assumptions, uncritical assumptions that were running amongst a lot of people who were supposedly well educated and understanding of these things.
Yes, yes.
So that's the quick answer to your question.
No, thank you.
The quick answer to your question about where social work best is located is that I think it's in the location that is most likely to help further social work values. And you flow back from that into other infrastructures.
And it's interesting.
Amongst if you're going to be linked with any particular discipline, essentially by university dictate, then I suppose education's as good as any, I suppose. But you see, education, again, it's ambiguous because education's got very ambiguous status as a discipline. If it often is just used in relation to teaching teachers, and that's an important part of it. But there's a whole stack of stuff relating to these ongoing education of your population that should be relevant to a faculty of education in its own right. Trouble is, of course, as soon as you mount the sort of arguments I've just mounted, is university structures become very broad-based, and that doesn't help very much in reaching some sort of governance at the top of the, and so there are no simple answers, and it's essentially a continuing political process. Each generation has got to confront and live with the issues I'm talking about. And University of New South Wales has moved distressingly, I think, away from what I've been talking about. When I left the University of New South Wales as an active participant, became an emeritus professor and so on, unfortunately the School of Social Work was shoved back into the Faculty of Social Sciences and Arts and Social Sciences, with all the disadvantages that had originally been experienced in the early stages, but in very different circumstances now, of course.
It's thanks. It's really interesting because I was gonna say that a lot of the stuff that you are talking about relates to this notion of social work values, especially in the hierarchies. And I agree with you. I think seeing social workers, because I think social workers make good leaders, and I've seen that through recent conversations with different people across even the region who are in CEO positions of health. Yeah. So it's quite interesting to see how social work values are transferable across different areas, including leadership.
I think the problem is that, of course, as other disciplines become more insightful about social aspects and environmental aspects of their disciplines, they tend to incorporate them within their structure, not in a collaborative arrangement that recognises what I'm talking about, the autonomy of each of the participants. And notions of leadership are always a bit dicey, because again, there's a huge difference between paternalistic or maternalistic leadership and participatory democratic leadership. Huge difference. And notions of democracy again, are strongly related to what I'm talking about. If you mean by democracy, it's governance of the people, by the people, for the people. That Abraham Lincoln's succinct set of concepts. And so again, you'll see on my shelves, there's quite a lot of stuff on political philosophy and democracy and so on.
Yes.
So, and for me, all this stuff, you can see the interrelationships between all these things.
Yes. Yes.
And each of the so-called professions is constantly in an ongoing, each generation, in an ongoing, I don't like the word battle, I don't like war analogies relating to social processes rather, but it goes to an ongoing task of recruiting enough people to continue the intellectual and practice traditions of the thing that they've made a commitment to.
And that's and I'm conscious of time, so I might ask this last question, and I'm keen to also just get some brief feedback about your experience of studying social work at the University of Sydney, and why you chose to do that. Do you think, so social work education, people becoming social workers, the idea of what we can do across society, is the future bright for social work education and for the profession, considering what's happening in space and place?
I think it's always dicey to start predicting or prescribing what might happen, you would want to happen, or whatever. It depends what you're talking about, I think. I've always had nagging in my mind the notion that surely reasonable people, whatever it means by reasonable people, will understand more and recognise more the concerns of social work. But that's one thing. It's how then you in fact interpret those concerns and get them on an ongoing process basis for those concerns to be in that generation effectively operating in their environment, their society. And sometimes a whole process like that can be stuffed up or delayed or whatever by just a small number of powerful figures in university structures. For example, if the University of New South Wales is headed by someone like Fred Hilmer, who came out of very much a managerial economic background, not broadly based in the social sciences. He got a very different set of general attitudes and climate, because people are anticipating what the Vice-Chancellor might accept and what he may not accept. And University of New South Wales did undertake, I think, a significant shift in attitude, thank goodness, when they are appointed from, so Britain, I wish the appointments reflected more cultural background in Australia, but because they knew the Australian cultural environment more. Ian Jacobs came from Britain and made very significant changes that are still operating within the University of New South Wales. He's now just gone back to Britain. But he in fact had a background, actually it was in, as I recall, he was a medical scientist and really understood far more about the relevant significance of all the things social is concerned about. And I, in fact, had the cheek to, at one stage, provide him with the 6 volumes of my autobiography because of his expressed interest in these things. Right. And he, bless his heart, seemed to take a real interest in what I'd done. He said, "Look, John, I can't guarantee I'll be reading these every night." But he said, I'll certainly dip into them. Mm. And before, contact with him, I guess it must be a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now. I did say to him, "Look, if you..." No, sorry, I won't go that way, this is too long. So anyway, but I'm just saying about the significance of the specifics of that. And what I'm saying too emphasises how little adequate social welfare history has been. There's a huge gap in historiography of adequate accounts of agencies, social organisations whose prime purpose has been the pursuit of social well-being of one kind or another. Of course there are histories, but they tend to be celebratory. They're not historical, they do not reflect professional historians' insights and understandings. And related to that is that one of the key tasks, I think, of all of us in the so-called educational groups is to leave some kind of honest record of what's going on so that it can be utilised in understanding processes over time, not just your experience of them in a particular point in time. And so that reflects back to my historical grounding and understanding of the significance of history if you're trying to understand us as people and the human species and so on. Yeah. In recent times, of course, ethics has got expanded into the non-human elements, and there's an ongoing debate, of course, about human beings interact with the non-human elements in society. And that's a whole bag of tricks which is beyond pursuing within social work as such. So that's the response there. Very quickly, before I forget it, I don't want to not mention the significance of the sabbatical leaves. When I've gone overseas, and it was always expected, of course, of my generation of academics, that you would have to go periodically overseas to further your education, because there was a keen awareness of the geographical isolation of Australia. And certainly my overseas injections of stimulus have been, in the different ways, very significant. When I went to, it was in the early, at the University of Michigan, I've already mentioned. The next sabbatical I took when I'd been at University of New South Wales, must have been about 1974, somewhere around there. I went to the University of York in Britain because it was on the urging of Joan Iden, who was a senior lecturer in social policy at that university, and I met Joan in my international work that I've been beginning to do, which I'll mention in a moment. And Joan Iden had urged me to come to York because of my combined interest in social policy and social work. And I went there because, in fact, Kathleen Jones, was the social policy head of that department that she was in. And she was a very powerful, influential social policy scholar in Britain in the social admin tradition. Her doctorate was in mental health services in Britain. She was, for example, employed by the British government at one stage to look at what was happening in Ireland and the abuses that were happening in Ireland by the establishment. So a very significant figure. And she was the editor of the Social Policy Yearbook in Britain back at that stage. Now, I really greatly appreciated my interactions with Kay. And again, our family came, and this time they were teenagers. Different experience, not as untroubled as the one had been in Ann Arbor. And the social work course, however, was in bad shape. And they'd appointed a social psychologist to head up the social work course. And the real running on social work course was being made by young lecturers. So I tried my best to help that situation. So that was that sabbatical. It was 6 months. The next sabbatical would have been when I gave up as head of school and Tony Vincent took over. I got out of Tony's hair and I thought deliberately it was a good idea to let him have a go as head of school. And I always said with Tony, very early on, I said, look, Tony, people are going to try to play us off against each other. I'm not in that game, and I'm sure you're not either. And he couldn't have agreed more. So we've always had a very good collaborative relationship. And when Tony died just a few years ago, I felt very sad and very deprived, really, because over the years I've maintained regular discussions with him as a friend and also concerned about common concerns, professional concerns, and I miss those. Tony was by far my closest academic colleague in my period when I left the university. But at the University of New South Wales, going quickly back to that Social Welfare Research Centre, when Tony decided not to take up that chair, we appointed Adam Graycar. Dr. Adam Graycar was someone who had taught government stuff in our course at University of New South Wales, and Adam had gone to Flinders University to a lectureship in social administration, and he had started writing, which was quite clearly in this British social administration tradition. And so he was appointed, and I think he took up the appointment about 1980, I suppose. I was on the selection committee, and in fact I was the one who suggested that we should look at his application again when Tony pulled out. Adam came, had a very effective 5-year stint. Then after that, the time when he decided to leave, and he subsequently became a very senior person in social sciences. Actually, he became the director of the School of Social Sciences at ANU. I was just trying to remember what happened with that centre. Peter Saunders, Dr. Peter Saunders, who was a professor of I think he was a senior lecturer in economics at Sydney University. He'd come from Britain originally. He was appointed, and he maintained leadership of that centre right through, and is now a very senior Emeritus Professor and involved in a whole lot of high-level appointments in the Australian scene, and he's just been appointed an AO. And he has written his personal biography, which he made sure I had a copy of, and just re-established contact with us, which is nice. So that's that story. So that's again reflected. All that social policy stuff is reflected in the collection I've got, the books. There's a lot of social policy material there reflecting that part of my set of concerns.
Yes, which is fantastic.
And so you see, it does all connect, it does interrelate.
Yes. I should ask maybe the Redfern Legal Centre, if I may, please.
While all this was going on, there are other things that I was involved in.
Have a break for a minute, Dan.
Yes,
Pause.
let me ask. Yes, sorry. I will pause. So talking about Redfern Legal Centre.
Yes, the Redfern Legal Centre. Hal Wooten was the very significant first Dean of the Law School at University of New South Wales. And he invited me to be part of the first board set up to develop the Aboriginal Legal Service. It was a very interesting experience. I, in fact, did stick with that development in its early days. They were very troubled periods. Hal had managed to get some Indigenous law students, including Paul Coe and Gary Williams. And the aim with Hal was, of course, it was to hand over the running of the whole thing to the Indigenous people themselves when they were ready for it. We had some quite extraordinary meetings. The meetings you never quite knew when they began or when they ended. and Hal never had an agenda. He said, no, it's too much structure for these people to cope with. And so they were quite extraordinary meetings. And one of them, I remember, it extended well after midnight. And then suddenly there was a smell of smoke. And we looked down, and just a couple of doors down in this area in Redfern, there was a place on fire. So we very thankfully had an excuse to get out and leave that meeting behind us.
Yes.
But right towards the end, there were only two of us who were of non-Indigenous background, I think, on that board. You're right towards the end of this period I'm talking about. And one, David Barr was his name. He was a very experienced lawyer in a main law area, firm down in Sydney. I remember David saying to me, he said, oh, John, what are we doing here? Because Billy had come in, one of the Indigenous young fellas, full as a goog, and starting berating us whiteys and really getting stuck into us. And he went on and on until, thank goodness, Mum Shirl. Now, Mum Shirl was a very powerful Indigenous leader, not only in the legal centre, but also especially in the health services area in Redfern. Mum Shirl said, "Shut up, Billy. These people are trying to help us. Don't you understand?" And really got stuck into him. And he, thank goodness, did cease. And I remember afterwards saying, that was when David Barr said, well, what are we doing here, John? I said, look, you especially, you need to be here, David, to help them with making sure the structures in the office will hold up administratively and legally. Now subsequently, it must have been, I suppose, when I went to York on the sabbatical, I resigned from the board. But the real problems, because in fact Gary Foley, who was a very, very well-known young activist, he got involved with the board, and there's evidence, I think, that he was using funds for his family. These were Commonwealth funds, and of course it was making the centre vulnerable to being closed, and Hal Woodton was acutely aware of that. And thank goodness on that occasion, Gary Williams intervened and made the running with Gary Williams and told him what was at stake. Now subsequently, that centre, Paul Coe, became a very strong chairman of the centre of what it was called. Paul ran into strife because in fact he again was accused of using funds in inappropriate ways. So it had a very bumpy beginning, that centre, but developed and was used as a model across the country for the establishment of Aboriginal legal services.
And what years were you involved in?
Well, that would have been, I guess, 69 through to about 74, I suppose.
Pretty early.
Yeah, very early.
Yeah.
I was just saying before, I've got one last question, but before I do, for both of you, in regards to your involvement with social work in the community, what is the role of social work with First Nations communities?
Not an easy at one level it's easy enough to answer, but in terms of actually implementing it, it's another thing. I think on a general level, I think Indigenous people, like any other people, are engaged in structures and processes and cultures that influence the way they experience their lives. It's massively complicated by the fact that, of course, you're not talking about neat encapsulated groups. It's a very massive demographic picture in terms of who you're dealing with. And I think that if you're going, and you need to have, I can't see any arguments for not having social work involved, and involved in a pretty significant way with this particular part of the population. You've got to be able to get legitimacy, not just in the establishment, so-called, but of course with the populations that you're dealing with. Well, that's no different, of course, than trying to deal with other populations. I mean, again, I did a lot of significant work in the area of disability in the very early stages. That's another story, which we haven't got time for now. And when you're trying to recruit Indigenous populations, I think it's difficult to argue that people recruited should only be recruited for providing a service to Indigenous people. That confines their perspective. It confines their career choices. It doesn't pay regard to their lives and how they can operate over time as people, and especially as professionals. And you can't have notions of adequate professionalism, I believe, unless you're embedded in a much wider range of structures that inevitably will give you a way of understanding and looking at the world that there's no way in which your so-called population targets will have. So it's a complicated, as I'm sure you're only too well aware, set of arguments, but I can't see why, given the recruitment of significant numbers of social work practitioners of whatever background, could not and should not provide the opportunity to interact with these populations. And when you look at the degree of arrogant paternalism that's been running by government in relation to a lot of those populations, you can argue it desperately needs the understanding of social work, community social work especially, but group work, and that's where I think we're at. And each lot of governments that come along, make a lot of gestures in that area, but they're not well grounded in terms of understandings that would make those gestures more than just gestures.
Love all that.
Yeah,
Love all that.
absolutely.
Love all that.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you some time to breathe, so I'll ask the last final question unless you want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that as well. So, in terms of that, absolutely. And then also, so that whole tokenistic engagement, I mean, it's got to be real. And then you get into educating Aboriginal people, like having them as part of the systems. And I think that whole being invited into communities, all relationship-based at the individual level, and then at the structural level, obviously, the inequalities, the racism, and so I think the profession has a structural place up here, and the educating of the next generation. But also, complementing that, I'm just reading a book at the moment on Aboriginal astronomy.
Awesome.
And the whole theory of knowledge. I think we have to revise our theory of knowledge and actually learn. So it has to be this two-way, very equal relationship of learning from them. And if you look at sustainability and climate change, and so there's no differentiating the Aboriginal theory of knowledge between planet and the skies. And so it's all one. And so what we do down here is reflected up in the stars and in the skies and things like that. We just have so much to learn in our theory of knowledge. And so I think that also needs to be embedded and have Aboriginal people teach us about the planet and communities and social systems as well. So just wanted to throw that in there as well.
Love all of that as well. That's
I've
fantastic.
worked in Aboriginal communities up in Queensland.
Yes.
So I've spent quite a lot of time there and learned a lot. And the more time you spend, the more you realise, the less you know. Yeah.
Totally. I feel the same. Yeah. I feel exactly the same. That's awesome.
The other major loose end, I'm sorry, but it'd be false of me not to mention it, is that I've mentioned being involved internationally. Now that has been a very significant part of my professional life over the years, in contrast to most of my peers. Very few were operating at an international level for a long period of time, and I don't know what the current situation is. It's better than it was, I'm sure. But when I say operating internationally, there are two key bodies: the International Council on Social Welfare. That's, as it were, the broad overarching social policy framework Now, I was involved in that because I did a lot of work with ACOS, and at one stage was an acting vice president, and so and they were doing all the time on my social policy background. I knew the executive directors well for ACOS, each of them, and had a lot of time for those people. I saw that as essentially a social work task, even though of course it can be done effectively to some extent by others. Essentially a social work task because the overall frames that social work brought to it. Now, that's one set of organisations. The other was the profession, social work profession organised internationally. That's the International Association of Schools of Social Work, and and the other body was the IFS, International Federation of Social Workers, IFSW. Now, there was an attempt at one stage to get much closer relations between those bodies. But again, it raised all the issues about the relationship of a profession to social policy at an international level. Same set of issues, but played out in a very different way internationally. Now that, I won't go into any detail of that, but that set of influences, I always had a whole lot of international connections, not just within the Anglo-European frame, but also across Asia. Colleagues in the Philippines and so on, and I did spend periods sometimes working in those contexts. I was involved in the UNSW thing. I was the chairman of the very influential experience, was chairman of the working party before the IFSW conference in Manila. Oh, when would that have been? About 1970, 71, somewhere around there. And that group, I mean, it was talk about a challenging exercise. We were expected to meet together before the conference, a few days before the conference, and in a hotel, concentrate on the national reports that were coming in from all the member agencies at the national level, ACOS in Australia's case, on what the state of social welfare was in each of those countries, and then make some kind of overarching set of, I mean, it was crazy stuff, but it was the sort of context where you're working with colleagues and really putting your head down and not getting much sleep and so on. And I developed strong connections in doing that. I mentioned Joe Nyden being a member of that group at one stage. That's why I went to York eventually. Another very close long-term colleague was Richard Splain, who's a very senior in the Canadian welfare system. And Dick subsequently became a professor at Columbia, across the west coast, University of British Columbia, on the west coast. Is that right? Yes. Anyway, Dick he'd done the social policy courses in London after the war. I think he'd been an airman during the war. And so that was an important set of influence on me, all that international stuff. I did subsequently become a vice president of the International Association of Schools of Social Work, I think. And there was some question about I might stand for the presidency, but that didn't eventuate. I couldn't get enough money from the federal government to make that feasible. So that was all that stuff. When you're talking about a life spent in all this area. Of course, there were many aspects of it, and I tried to pick out the main bits in my website, the biography. The autobiography you can get access to on the website still. I tried to get that published. The publisher went broke, and academic publishing, as you know, is becoming extraordinarily difficult and limited in the recent times because of all the digital material that's developing. And so people weren't interested when I offered my library elsewhere, University of New South Wales especially, of course. They came and checked my library and said, oh, look, and in fact a couple of senior librarians came and looked at it. They said, look, we'll take photographs of the spines, and they checked and they said, look, most of this is available online and we can't practically do anything about it. So that's the background of the library story. And it really grieved me, the notion of, it's like burning books,
Yes.
throwing them in the bin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All that
Yeah.
material,
Yes. And
which I know reflects an enormous range of capacities and interests and concerns over generations.
Well, I've already had conversations with some of my colleagues and before coming today saying how excited they were about being able to receive parts of your collection, so especially from a research point of view.
So that's the story there, and I better mention also the Social Policy Research Centre. I did write a history of it after the first 25 years of that centre. Again, primarily to make sure the record has somewhere, historical record, of that development of that organisation.
Yes.
Now, I always hoped that that organisation would lay the foundation for establishing social policy as a discipline in its own right, as it has in Britain, and a few other places in the world, but not many.
Yes.
Does in Finland, for example. But it's never happened in the way in which I hoped it might happen.
Yes. Yes.
Sydney University, as you know, Bettina Cass
Yes.
went from the Social Welfare Research Centre to Sydney University and was involved in social work education. That again, there wasn't that degree of political effectiveness to achieve that. She had other agendas, fair enough, and she was extraordinarily broadly based, well experienced social researcher. But I can remember interviewing her for, I think it was an appointment in the Social Welfare Research Centre, because she came out of sociology at New South Wales University, and asking her what did she know about social policy in Britain and Richard Titmuss and so on. At that stage, I guess the reasonable answer was not very much. Now, of course, all that changed. So that's enough of all that stuff, I think.
All good, all
More
good.
for another
So,
day, I think.
last question then, and I'll start with you to give you some time to have a bit of a break. Social work, the University of Sydney, what's been your experience, and tell me more about that.
So I think you originally asked me too why I went to Sydney, not New South Wales, and that's a very straightforward answer. I went to Sydney because Dad was still head of school at New South Wales, and I knew most of the staff.
Yes.
So I didn't want to be there in their hair, so wanted to be out on my own. So went to Sydney. Had a great run through at Sydney. So this is 1980 onwards, and at that time it was individual, group, and structural, so social policy. Yeah. And I wanted to specialise in working with kids or doing reforms for children and young people. So did some of all of those three areas. My time there, I mean, it's interesting. That's a long time ago, but I still use the knowledge and the skills and that grounding, as we were talking earlier today in the conversation, that professional, that placing people in a systems theory, looking at structural inequalities, that whole perspective I still use in my professional job every day. Yeah. And so I subsequently then took myself off to Berkeley to get some more specialised skills in quantitative, which wasn't available at the university at the time. But those two areas, the quantitative measurement and that people's empowerment, and it was a bit radical when I went through. We still had, I'd just come out of, there were lectures on making bombs a few years before I'd been there, so.
At the University of Sydney?
Yeah, University of Sydney. So there was some radicalism. One of the most, a very interesting reflection was in one of our last tutorials, we had a colleague who was a Muslim woman, who was married, Muslim, and she gave a very searing reply back to the course, because the course was pretty much had gone quite radical. And so it was, and she had sat there as a Muslim woman, married, in what was seen as quite a traditional role. And so she gave a very searing reply to the course and some of the radical components, which I thought was fantastically balancing because it had swung so much to one direction. So it was an interesting time to be going through. There was Michael Horsburgh, Janet George, and many other people there at the time. But interesting times. Yeah.
I might just mention that I knew Stuart Rees, of course, pretty well, and Stuart, I remember I'd say to Stuart, look, he's talking about radical social work. If you look at our course, we've got a more radical course than you have, because it addresses the structures and grounding within which all this stuff's operating. He didn't like that. But Stuart came out of course, Britain.
Yes.
And British social work education was clearly a laggard for a long, long time because of the structures there. Yes. Again, they hadn't developed, for years, decent social work degree structures at all. And it was too often tagged on with social administration. It's now seen as social work and social policy. There's some or other that covered the relevant spectrum. And of course, me, because I was firmly embedded in both those traditions, every time I spent a period in the UK, particularly that time we went in 74, I had interesting discussions with colleagues there in both social work practice and those in social work, social policy, social admin, about those structures and about the need to shake loose from the historical origins of the social work education and develop autonomous structures and not be under the university frameworks that had originally set up those courses by professors who were interested in the practical aspects of their subjects. So, they'd set up these courses. So, these things all feed into each other.
And your time at the University of Sydney in social work?
My time at the Sydney University, I've mentioned briefly I felt very fortunate to have as two key senior colleagues there, Norma Parker and Kate Ogilvy. Very different but very interesting characters, and Norma always kept in touch with each other about what was happening. And Norma, subsequently, when she came back to University of New South Wales at one stage, a few years after we'd got the course underway there, she was really pleased about what we developed in terms of a full range of structures, because she knew only too well the significance of what we're doing in terms of trying to get long-term achievement there. Tom Brennan was head of the department then, at Sydney University, had very good relationships with Tom at that stage, and he couldn't have been more supportive of me as in this young lecturer in this new role, in this new area. And so I had very good dealings with Tom by and large. He, of course, subsequently ran foul of what happened in Sydney University. And when the students tried to use intimidation against Tom later, I thought, you've picked the wrong target there, because Tom's not going to roll over. He was a Yorkshireman, son of I think, an Italian immigrant, something like that. And Tom dug in his heels, and really, and that became a terrible impasse at Sydney University, and really had long-term destructive effects when that was running. And that was very sad, because all my colleagues were involved there that I'd known well over this period. So, interesting, a mixed bag, inevitably, in terms of experiences. And I guess it's what you do with the experiences is the key to telling your life and understanding something about your life. I mean, the notion of trying to understand life as a whole is hazardous, to say the least of it. So that's Sydney University. Yes, at that stage it was a prestigious university, and University of New South Wales was disparagingly called as the tech. Yes. Kenzo Tech.
Yes.
And so it was a bit of a challenge to go to that kind of environment when I was in the chair and so on. But in many ways it was a good place to go, because in fact everyone at University of New South Wales was fully aware of a competitive relationship inevitably developing. And we weren't hampered by historical structures and historical memories.
Yes.
So that's the...
Dad, we better wind up, I think.
Yes.
I think that's it.
And I just love everything that you've just said there around the historical context and importance of people's journey. And it sounds like, as you've generously shared with us today, how your career as a social work professor, as an academic, has journeyed across the many decades, which has also involved, of course, the University of Sydney, and how that has been a role in where you've done, or where you've undertaken your work as a social worker, as an educator, but as a professor, the first professor of social work, that has enabled us to have a proud and hopefully an evolving profession that continues to be responsive to human and social need. Thank you so much.
I didn't mention, of course, many things I didn't mention, but what I was going to say was that there was a period soon after I was appointed to the chair at University of New South Wales, when I was the president of the professional association ASW. And that was a period where social education was a hot topic, because they were beginning to pop up in non-university context, these diploma courses, thoroughly inadequate as professional courses. Some did subsequently develop adequately, but it was only by the work we did in the ASW and ongoing work with the ASW with other social education colleagues that we managed to get the 4-year degree accepted by the university, by the professional association, as the basic qualification for membership of the professional association. And that's an ongoing task, and it's got to be held on to.
Yes.
very strictly.
Dad, you can have another chat another day, I think, on the whole AASW, I think.
Oh, totally.
Anyway, that we
Thank you so much.